Politicians in Florida just passed a new state budget, which is basically the document that says how they're going to spend your money over the next year. And they're going to spend more than $100 million of your money just on culture wars. This is a budget. They're cutting funding all over their place. They're eliminating jobs across state government. They're continuing to chronically underinvest in, mental health, in pre-kindergarten, in elderly programs and care for disabled folks. But they are spending lavishly, banning books and banning abortion and brainwashing teachers. We're going to walk you through all of it in just a sec. Hello, and welcome back to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name seeking rents comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. Well, the Florida legislature has finally finished its 2025 legislative session. It ended a little after 11 p.m., I believe, on Monday night, when on day 105 of what was supposed to be a 60-day legislative session. And it ended with the House and Senate, the Republican-controlled House and Senate, both finally agreeing on a roughly $115 billion state budget. This is, the budget is the one thing they have to do every year. The one requirement the Constitution sets for the legislature when it comes to session is that it has to pass a budget. And so this was the subject of a months-long stalemate in Tallahassee over just how much to cut in spending and how to cut taxes, that sort of thing. It now goes to the governor, Ron DeSantis, who has the ability to strike individual lines from the budget. This is called a line item veto. This is like a really powerful thing. The president of the United States does not have a line item veto. And so he's going to spend the next little bit going through figuring out just how savagely he wants to go to town on this after what was at times a really bitter session between he and particularly the House. One of the interesting sort of dynamics that's come out of this sort of belated budget is that the governor has a lot less time to go through stuff. So normally the governor and his staff will have weeks. They'll spend almost a month going through like every line in the budget, figuring out who it's important to, which legislator wants it, which lobbyists want it, which donors wanted it, and figuring out what sort of must be protected and what can be axed, particularly because so much of the governor's approach to vetoes is just built around trying to get up to a headline number. I remember him discussing once, like, he didn't even think much about what he was vetoing. In a lot of cases, he was just trying to get up over $1 billion. He wanted to say he vetoed $1 billion from the budget. So that's the kind of dynamic. So much of what they do is figuring out what they can veto without sort of affecting, political donors, that sort of thing. So, but anyway, I figure we should probably talk a little bit. We should do a little podcast on the budget because obviously that's an enormous deal. It's, like I said, it's $115 billion. It's the most important thing the legislature does every single year. It is sort of a tricky thing to write good stories or do, good podcasts, I guess, about the budget in the sense of, so much of the story of the budget, particularly in a state in Florida that is like just notoriously underfunds public services and public programs, and is a notoriously low tax state for businesses, not for people, for businesses. It's a very low tax state. The biggest overarching story of the budget every year is just what it does not fund. It's not them going in and cutting, even though they did do some cutting this year. I believe, I'm going off memory here, but I believe this year's budget is about $3 billion lower than the current year budget. And this is a lot of COVID relief, federal COVID relief money is kind of rolling off the books. So I think that's driving some of this. But it's not so much about cutting. It's just about what they choose not to fund. And it's like almost across any metric that you might care about, Florida ranks near the bottom of the country in terms of spending on it. So like Florida's near the bottom on like spending on mental health, on education, on elderly programs, on services for people with disabilities, And of course, we're like near the top. Low tax Florida, low tax state like Florida is near the top on toll roads, miles of toll roads. You end up you eat this stuff in other ways. One I always focus on because I hear so much from folks about how important that early childhood education is and child care is for working families. Florida is 44th in the country right now on per student spending on preschool, right? Like Alabama, the state of Alabama spends far more than Florida does on preschool when you evaluating by student. So, and this is the same story basically every year. You could do this exact same thing every year, but that is probably the most important thing to know about the budget. Within it, there are like a million different stories. There are like fascinating political stories, there are fascinating, programmatic stories. So like the dominant storyline out of this session, or one of the dominant stories out of this session, has been the fight over the scandal that blew up around Hope, Florida. Hope, Florida is Ron and Casey DeSantis's, like, they would call it like a philosophy. It's kind of like really messy and ephemeral about what it is. There's kind of like part of it is a nonprofit foundation they've set up to kind of raise money, and some of it is using like essentially state employees and turning them into like caseworkers for this. And they talk the way they cast it. It's a program designed to like get people off of like public support programs by connecting them with charitable services and that sort of thing. Essentially moving them over to churches and stuff it seems to be a big goal of Hope, Florida. But this became an enormous controversy when it turned out that the governor and his senior most aides diverted $10 million from a settlement with a Medicaid contract. So $10 million of public money meant for the Medicaid program, diverted it through the Hope Florida Foundation and turned around and gave it all to a couple of political dark money nonprofits that were helping finance the governor's campaign against a marijuana constitutional amendment last year. So it has all the hallmarks of turning public money into private political ad money. And it is literally the subject of a criminal investigation in Tallahassee right now. And so amidst all that, the governor was hoping to get a bunch more public money. I think it was something like $4 million in like 40 positions. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me for Hope, Florida, specifically. Like basically they've been like grabbing like state employees across different agencies and like turning them into Hope Florida caseworkers. This was to like create a formal office and like dedicated workers for this. Legislature didn't fund any of that stuff. So that's like a really interesting political story out of the budget. There's another sort of fascinating environmental story out of the budget. They have put $6.5 million into the budget to restore the Ocklawaha River in kind of north central Florida. And this means breaching a decades old dam that was built back in, I believe, the 1970s, when they were trying to build a barge canal across the upper half of Florida, the Florida Peninsula. They never completed the canal because it was an environmentally disastrous and economically stupid decision. But this dam got built and it backed up the Ocklawaha River, sort of like radically altered the environment up there. But it also created this big lake, this reservoir that's become a popular like bass fishing place over the years. So this fight about whether or not to breach the Rodman Dam in Florida has been one of the longest running and most intractable environmental fights in Florida for decades. This was the big issue when I covered the governor's race in 2006. And so the big issue on the Democratic side in that primary. And so the budget puts $6.5 million. It spends $6.5 million essentially to breach the dam and begin the restoration of this river. Although there is already a veto campaign being launched, so who knows whether the governor will actually sign that. He vetoed money for a study around this stuff last year. There's already, the legislature had one of the weirder things, when they negotiate a final state budget, the House and the Senate, they each pass their own budget and they come together and do this thing called conference, this sort of dance where they bring stuff together. And so in the conference process, they had agreed to go to $15 million. That's an enormous amount of money for a project like that, particularly one that's been so controversial. But then they mysteriously like opened that back up and went back down to $6.5 million, which never a good sign when they're backtracking on stuff they'd already agreed on. So this seems like a high likelihood of veto, but if it doesn't, like just a monumental environmental story, and I'm sure there'll be an enormous campaign to try and, in addition to the campaign that's already started trying to get the governor to veto it, there'll be a campaign, I'm sure, from environmentalists to get him to spare that money. So there's these kinds of stories all across the budget. It's $115 billion of spending, and like basically, there's an interesting story behind almost every line item. On kind of more of a macro level. If you're looking for there are good stories in the budget. There's good news. So folks listening to this might know there was a big dust up earlier on in session where there was a push to cut funding for advanced placement, international baccalaureate programs in Florida high schools, all these kind of accelerated courses, advanced courses. Just an insane idea, but like again, Florida just chronically underfunds stuff. But the legislature backed away from that idea. From what I understand, this budget fully funds AP and IP and all that sort of stuff. One that I think is a really good story. We just wrote about this on the newsletter. This new budget like essentially guts the governor's budget, his budget to spend on high priced lawyers. Like the governor has thrown tens of millions of dollars of contracts at like high priced law firms and stuff. Some paying like almost $800 an hour to defend controversial laws, to defend like legally questionable executive actions, like when he cannibalized a bunch of public money for political advertisements in his campaign to advertise against the abortion and marijuana amendments last year. He hired an attorney, a law firm, and used them to threaten TV stations that were airing abortion ads that he didn't like. There's like lots of crazy stuff he's done with this money, in addition to just like rewarding firms that are run by some of his biggest fundraisers and donors. So the legislature is like, in addition to like cutting his legal budget way down, they're also going to make the administration disclose far more details about all the contracts they're giving to law firms. Like, I think that's a great thing. Like at minimum, getting more sort of sunlight into just how much money we're sending out the door to $800 an hour attorneys would be a great thing for taxpayers to know, and just sort of get a sense of just how fiscally conservative some of these fiscal conservatives really are. On the flip side, the budget slashes funding for Florida Forever, which is like the state's main environmental land buying program. So it's going to spend a ton less money. I believe they're cutting it from $100 million to $18 million for land buying. Instead, they've generally in Florida, they've been shifting money away from acquiring land, buying land for conservation, into essentially buying easements on agricultural property, and basically buying the development rights from farms and agribusinesses, which then allows the farming operation to continue. Just it can't develop into housing down the road. And there are some good arguments for it. It is far cheaper to buy the development rights, just the development rights, than than buying the land outright. So you can stretch a preservation budget further. And like farmland is often, it's not right to consider it preserved land, because there's a lot of contamination that happens from, the fertilizers and the pesticides and the herbicides and all the operations that happen on a working farm. But it is generally open space, which is really important for like connecting areas and ensuring like sort of wildlife corridors and stuff like that. The flip side, you do it this way, there's no public access. These can't become public state parks, for instance. It also there's like, I've not dove in deeply into these programs, but the one thing you hear a lot of is these programs become a way to reward a bunch of donors, like agribusiness donors. You go buy their easements and stuff. So it's, there's some ickiness around it too. Like a good sort of environmental program probably does a blend of land acquisition and easements, but the legislature, this budget is going whole hog into easements instead. And then we alluded to this, I think, in a recent show. There's one of the biggest budget decisions they make every year in Florida is how much and how they want to cut taxes. And so they ended up passing a roughly $1.3 billion package of tax cuts, and it is almost entirely tax breaks for businesses. It's about $1 billion of that 1.3, so 75 cents of every dollar is cutting taxes that businesses pay. So these savings go directly to businesses. This is another thing, we had an item about this on the newsletter not too long ago, so I don't want to go too deep into it, but it's just the same tired trickle down bullshit you hear when legislators, when they talk a big game all session long about helping families directly, right? Like the stuff they kept talking about all session was cutting the statewide sales tax or permanently exempting inexpensive clothing from sales tax. Those are things that would have directly helped consumers. And we get to the end of the session, and lo and behold, those ideas are gone, and we're back to cutting. The biggest thing here is to be clear, there's like a bunch of larded up special interest tax breaks on NASCAR tickets. There's like a giveaway to this horrible investment company that we've talked about before. There's, tax breaks on data centers, all kinds of stuff like that. But the biggest thing here, like basically all more than $900 million, is they are finally eliminating the sales tax Florida charges on commercial leases. So the business lobby calls this the business rent tax. And the legislature has been like, in response to business lobbying, led by the way, like big business lobbying groups like the Florida Chamber of Commerce and the Florida Retail Federation, who's like primary funders, and the people they're primarily looking out for are businesses like Publix supermarkets and Walmart, who rent a lot of property in strip malls. And by the way, even if like a company like Walmart owns its store, it is still renting it. So like one of the most common tax dodges out there is large companies will shift their physical property into different subsidiaries and then pay themselves to rent it. And this creates, on a corporate tax level, creates all sorts of games that you can play to dodge corporate taxes this way. But in Florida, for the longest time, these strategies haven't really worked because we had this business rent tax, because you ended up having to pay sales tax on those rent, and now that's going away. So there's like all sorts of ways this is going to end up like disproportionately rewarding a lot of large companies. And again, I don't want to go too deep. I'll throw a link to the piece we wrote so you can sort of like read my rant if you want to. But I did want to respond to a couple of points that keep coming up, because I think a bunch of journalists in Tallahassee did a good job of like at least like pushing lawmakers on this idea that you said you were going to help families, and here we are back in the same fucking place we end up every session, where we're just showering money on businesses and leaving table scraps for everybody else. And in addition to all the same old Ronald Reagan trickle down crap you get out of them, they immediately fall back on this idea that Florida is the only state, I believe it's Florida and like Manhattan or New York City or something, that charges a business sales tax on commercial rent. And I haven't actually gone through the 50 state tax codes to verify that, but like professional staffers that I trust have said that before. So I think it's safe to assume that's right. Florida is the only state in the country that does this. Florida is also one of the only states in the country that allows the vast majority of businesses to earn profits entirely tax-free, entirely free of state taxes. And what I mean by that, Florida does not have a personal income tax, obviously. It also exempts pass-through businesses from its corporate tax. So, and what that means is there are a bunch of businesses that get exempted from federal corporate income taxes as pass-through businesses. The vast majority of businesses in this country are pass-through businesses because their shareholders are supposed to pay tax on their personal income tax return. Essentially, that profit gets moved gets imputed to your personal income tax return. So that's the whole logic for exempting pass-through businesses to begin with, because you're going to pay personal income tax on it. Florida doesn't have a personal income tax, yet still exempts pass-through businesses. So like I said, something like 90% of all businesses in Florida don't pay any state tax whatsoever on their profits. Any state profit, there's no corporate income tax. We also have like one of the most Swiss cheese like corporate income taxes in the country for big businesses. Like literally only 1% of all of businesses in Florida pay any corporate income tax at all. And those that do, these are like the true giants, the Disneys, the HCAs, the FPLs of the world, are paying far less than they should, because we allow all sorts of games. We allow them all these old strategies that we all know about that could very easily be closed. We refuse to close them. The Florida legislature year after year just turns a blind eye to all this shit, right? And so Florida is one of the only states that has this too. And the point I'm making here, and Florida has, as a whole, one of the lowest tax burdens for businesses in the country. There's a think tank called the Tax Foundation, which represents, like, its board of directors is like Amazon and Microsoft and Apple, a bunch of I think Procter and Gamble, big consumer products company. So it's like you get a sense of whose interest it's looking out for. It ranks Florida as the fourth best, most business friendly tax code in the country, and the best among big states. Like the others are like South Dakota and the states ahead of them. So the idea that of all the problems facing Florida, the one we had to dump $900 million into was getting rid of yet another business tax is just, it's utter bullshit. They're repeating talking points solely because like they just need something to grasp onto to defend the indefensible. And for what it's worth, this is what campaign contributions buy you is a willingness of legislators to just swallow your arguments whole cloth and adopt them as their own. There's man, I'm going to end up ranting in a way that I don't mean. But if you are a laid off worker trying to claim your unemployment benefits, or if you're like a single mom trying to get your food stamps, Republican politicians in Florida will metaphorically turn you upside down and shake the shit out of you to see what falls out of your pockets. And then when they're done with that, they're going to bend you over and give you a proctological exam to make sure that you're not hiding a quarter up there. But if you're a business, particularly a business with a whole bunch of lobbyists and a big budget for campaign contributions, it is nothing but blank checks and this like blind faith that you're gonna spend all the money we give you in the most benevolent way imaginable, and of course we're all gonna benefit from your generosity. That is the Florida way right there. So anyway, tax package pretty bad in my experience, in my opinion. And one other thing I'll say about this, I'm not even to like the main part of what I wanted to talk about today, but the biggest consumer tax cut in there is a back to school sales tax holiday in August. So what they are doing is they are making this permanent. So every year, the Florida legislature will usually pass a 1 to 2 week long sales tax holiday on clothing and backpacks, that sort of thing, usually around the beginning of August. This is making it the full month of August, and it is making it permanent. So this tax package, it's something like $170 million tax cut, permanent, not just a 1 year thing. The thing about tax holidays like this is they are bullshit too. These are gimmicks that do not save people money. So, and this is like, you can look at all the research on the left and the right. This is one place where like economists on across the spectrum come together, is that sales tax holidays are stupid gimmicks. They don't work to drive economic activity, like create economic activity. They might change the timing of purchases, but they don't like encourage people to spend more than they other would. So they're not generating any new economic activity. And in a lot of cases, the savings, if you actually sort of think about the dynamics of how it works, the savings actually end up going to businesses. So businesses need to create, the whole reason businesses do sales and stuff is to try and create some marketing urgency for you to come to the store and shop, right? And what sales tax holidays is do that for businesses. They don't have to do a sale themselves because they can just now market the tax holiday savings. So businesses end up doing less discounting, less sales than they otherwise would when you've got tax holidays. There has been research that shows some on some items, they actually raise prices during tax holidays. So if you follow it through to the end, the tax savings here, we say these are for this will save consumers money. It often ends up only saving the retailers money because they're essentially charging higher prices than they otherwise would. If the tax holiday didn't exist, the price you'd be paying for what you're buying would be lower in a lot of cases. So this is just, it is like just garbage economic policy, and everybody who like spends any time like reading about it and does anything other than does anything other than swallow the Florida Retail Federation's talking points, understands this. The one good thing I will say about this is, at least by making it permanent, they can't keep hiding behind this every year. So one of the things the Florida legislature is infamous for is every year it does these sales tax holidays as like one-time things. And so they use that. That's what they talk about. They go, we've passed another back-to-school sales tax holidays, and pay no attention to the fact that Publix and Disney and Walmart, they're all like ransacking the treasury in the meantime because that's all sort of coming in behind the tax holiday here. At least this takes that off the table. They're going to have to find something else, some other gimmick to con consumers into thinking they're helping them while they're turning around and rewarding all these big businesses. So, tax package, not the best. Like I said, I'll throw a link into the show notes about that so you read a bit more although I think I ended up saying most of what I wrote. So the other thing this is where I'm finally getting to what I wanted to talk about today. That one thing that jumped out to me in this year's budget is, they say about one of the reasons budgets are so important is they reveal like your priorities, the things that you most care about, like the things that you most care about, that's where you spend your money, And one of the things in this budget is, man, Florida cares about culture wars. This is like, I spent a bit of time this morning as I was thinking about what I wanted to say, like going through just like counting up like obvious just spending on culture war issues, all the, anti-abortion, book banning, all this kind of stuff in the budget, and just casually got to over $100 million. And so I want to run through some of the stuff in the budget, in the Florida budget, that you are paying for. This is, if you are a Florida taxpayer, this is your money that's getting spent on this. So I'm just going to run through a list of some of the things you just bought. So congratulations. There is more than $2 million in the budget to continue like purchasing this software system that is essentially a way to enable make it easier for like extremist parents to ban books from school libraries and stuff. It's essentially a statewide software system, ultimately going to cost $15 million overall, to make it easier for like, a crazy parent in Pensacola to register an objection that gets a book pulled from the shelves in like Fort Lauderdale or something like that. This is a podcast called Seeking Rents. Also worth noting, the vendor that got the contract, this $15 million contract, it hired a lobbying firm run by one of Ron DeSantis' very biggest fundraisers. So, culture wars, in addition to being expensive, they're also ripe for crony capitalism type stuff. There's almost $30 million in this budget for these anti-abortion, they call them crisis pregnancy centers, but essentially they're organizations that kind of like non-medical clinics. They call themselves clinics, but they're not medical places. And they exist basically to like talk and pressure pregnant people out of getting abortions. If you ever driven down, the Turnpike or I-75 or I-10, you see lots of these anti-abortion billboards. This is where you're paying for them. You're helping to pay for them. With this $30 million filters down to all the centers that are paying for this stuff. There is $5 million in this budget for this civics training program that was developed by Hillsdale College. That's the private conservative Christian college in Michigan that has been so influential in right-leaning education policy. And this is a training program that the state tries to pressure public school teachers to go through. Or I shouldn't say pressure. It tries to entice public school teachers to go through it. I think they get like I believe it's a $3,000 stipend if they go through this program. But it is, the Miami Herald has done some fantastic journalism around it. It is essentially like it is almost like overtly Christian version of civics. Critics would call it an attempt to brainwash public school teachers and give them $3,000 if they agree to sit through the brainwashing seminar. So $5 million for some Hillsdale civics programming in the budget. There's $300,000 in the budget to continue these intellectual diversity and viewpoint diversity surveys on college campuses, where they're trying to figure out, they're basically asking professors and students, what their partisan leanings are and stuff like this. It's all part of like a preconceived narrative of trying to like drive up essentially Republican enrollment. So they're trying to make schools part of the attempt to make schools explicitly conservative, right? $300,000 for that. There is $3 million got put into the budget at the very last minute to help jails expand so they can hold more detained immigrants by ICE, right? I think we alluded to this on another podcast. It wasn't quite clear in the budget documents how much it was. I think I may have mistakenly said it was like $50 or $60 million or something like that. I was misreading spreadsheets there. This was a $3 million for this. There is $500,000 for yet another anti-abortion group called the Human Coalition. This is an anti-abortion group in Texas that like uses like data analytics and marketing to essentially target abortion seekers, people looking for abortions, and try and like pressure them towards and steer them towards these anti-abortion counseling centers, the ones that got $30 million. Anyway, there's $500,000 of public money for the Human Coalition to operate like essentially a hotline in Florida now. There is a $10 million budget increase for New College of Florida, which is like probably the centerpiece of the DeSantis administration's to like essentially like partisanize public universities. Obviously, New College has been the site of the most aggressive sort of takeover and reorienting. And this one is interesting to me because like if you actually look over the last 5 years, the amount of general revenue, this is like discretionary money that the state lawmakers have to spend. So this is the most important money the state has, because you could spend it on whatever you deem most important. And so this is where like there's the most competition between like priorities and values and this sort of stuff. The amount of general revenue that New College of Florida gets from Florida has doubled in 5 years. And I bring that up as a reminder that like so many like faux fiscal conservatives or people that are just like looking to break government will often like trot out a line that says something to the effect of like money isn't spending money doesn't mean you care, or money doesn't solve anything, and they'll use that as an excuse to gut funding for things that they want to destroy. And what this shows is no, money does not fix everything, but it helps a lot of things. And when you really do care about something, even like right wing sort of anti government nuts understand that like you got to throw a bunch of money at it. And they've thrown so much money at New College of Florida. New College, like I said, it's basically a $10 million increase in this year's budget into its base budget, biggest increase of any of the state's 12 universities again. So there is also another $8 million to continue building out a building for the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. For those of you, this is, by the way, after they gave it $27 million. So that's $35 million in 2 years just for this building. The Hamilton Center is essentially an attempt to create an explicitly conservative college within the University of Florida's campus. If For folks listening to this that don't know the history here, there's like a really shady backstory where the language to create this was written by this like mysterious dark money group that like was formed specifically to lobby for the creation of a Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. And like the one name attached to it is this like this sort of like right wing guy that bounced around groups. He's been with the Heritage Foundation, the Project 2025 group. He's been with the Teneo Network, which is one of Leonard Leo's big groups. So this is essentially like a conservative Trojan horse, right, within the University of Florida. There's also, by the way, another $10 million in dedicated funding to the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Like this is $10 million that'll show up in the University of Florida's budget, but like it is only for the Hamilton Center's operations. There's $4 million to advertise for the beef industry. And maybe you're wondering to yourself, why the fuck is this guy calling $4 million for public advertising for the beef industry a culture war thing? Because this comes right after they banned the sale and the production of lab grown meat in Florida, and they passed this insane law this year that tries to prevent plant based meat from calling itself meat on its labels. Right? They've like essentially hamstrung all of these potential competitors to the beef industry. But the free market purists in the legislature, if that wasn't enough, they're also going to spend $4 million of your money on ads for the beef industry. There's also, going back to the tax package, there is a $1.1 million corporate tax break for essentially for the National Christian Foundation, it is one of the nation's largest charities, and it is one of the leading funders of some of the most far-right extremist causes you can find, like essentially efforts to completely ban abortion, efforts to strip rights from queer folks. The National Christian Foundation has emerged over the last like number of years as like one of the largest funders of that stuff in the country. And there's a $1.1 million tax break triggered that is for them in the tax package. And just to not to go too far into the weeds, but if you're wondering, like, it's a charity, why is there a corporate tax break? Because lots of donors will donate like income producing assets to charity. So like it might be stock in a business, it might be commercial real estate where you're earning income from like leasing property in a shopping center or something like that. Nonprofits this is considered like, they call this unrelated business income. Nonprofits are supposed to be paying income taxes on that kind of income. And the idea is here, you don't want to create a competitive advantage where simply by being a nonprofit, you could move into kind of like any kind of industry, real estate, grocery stores, whatever the case may be. You could have a competitive advantage because you don't have to pay income tax simply because you're a nonprofit. The Florida legislature is essentially abandoning that principle entirely, all to sort of please the National Christian Foundation. There is also a tax break on guns and ammunition in this year. It is part of what they're calling like a hunting and fishing camping sales tax holiday. Another one of these gimmicky sales tax holidays. Although I will say this one is 3.5 months. And when you start lengthening these things out, some of at least the impacts of it starts to ameliorate. It doesn't necessarily create any new activity. It still doesn't do anything for the economy, but some of those impacts I mentioned earlier with the back to school stuff, where like you get retailers doing less discounting or less or even raising prices during this. If you stretch the sales tax holiday out longer, that becomes at least less of an issue. But anyway, we're gonna do for basically 3.5 months. We're gonna have no taxes on the sales of guns and ammunition in Florida. This one. It's part of a larger thing, so it's a little bit tricky to pull out the exact numbers. But if you go through like the work papers on this stuff, it looks like that's about $23 million in last revenue, so people can buy tax-free guns in Florida for a few months. And this is one of those wild things where like if it does have like an economic impact, if it does have like I don't know, do we want to be incentivizing the people buying even more guns and buying even more ammunition? I don't know. Your mileage may vary on that, but it seems to me like that's probably not how I want my tax money being spent. And then the last one I'm going to mention, we're going to go back to higher education. And this one is sort of funny to me because it's so pathetic. But there is $15 million in the budget for something called the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom at Florida International University. And you might remember FIU is the university that just that Ron DeSantis just strong-armed into hiring his running mate as its new president, Jeanette Nunez, who was a former Republican state legislator, was Ron DeSantis' lieutenant governor, is now the president of Florida International University, FIU. And so, like I said, $15 million for this Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, which is supposed to be like focused on like, research around like free markets, that sort of thing. And the reason I kind of laugh at this is this has become like this is becoming almost like painfully funny about how it seems to exist just to like polish the reputations of Republican politicians. So we talked about the Hamilton Center earlier, and the Hamilton Center, the people that run that would like strenuously disagree with how I characterize that they are not explicitly conservative, and that it is not a partisan thing, and that it is like a serious academic institution. And so we can have that argument. Obviously, the origins of it being pushed by like a Heritage Foundation activist guy are coming from a clearly conservative space. But we can argue about like sort of the way it's actually manifesting itself, how sort of overtly conservative it is. The Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. So one of the things they've done in their short time on this earth is they created an award they called the Guardian of Freedom Award. And they gave their inaugural one away last year. And who did they give? Who was the inaugural Guardian of Freedom for the Adam Smith Center at FIU? Ron DeSantis. This university that we're funding with a bunch of taxpayer money is using its position to invent an award to give to the governor, essentially. And then the other thing that jumped out at me is this, again, the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom is supposed to sort of like focus on like free market ideals. I just, as a lark, pulled up I think it's their monthly magazine or something. And the founding director, the lead item in it is the founding director sort of promoting Donald Trump's tariffs, right? Like the thing that drives the Wall Street Journal editorial board more nuts than anything. The Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom is out here like gung-ho about it. So $15 million for those guys. Good work if you can get it. It sort of suggests to me that the governor likes getting awards. Like you give awards to Republican politicians, give jobs to Republican politicians. You get a bunch of taxpayer money from Republican politicians. So just running through that list, by the way, that's more than $100 million for what I think can very fairly be characterized as pure culture war stuff. So, like I said, they say budgets are a reflection of priorities. So it's pretty clear to see what the Florida legislature prioritizes. So. Okay, we're gonna leave it there. I'll probably be back with another budget or two. There's a number of stories around the budget that might be worth telling at some point. So look for another podcast in the next few days, and then obviously we'll keep coming beyond that as well. So in the meantime, if you could just click the like and subscribe buttons, those are super important. And if you haven't already, please think about signing up for a subscription. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. That'll have all our stories and podcasts emailed straight to your inbox. All right, thanks very much, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.